At 2:47 p.m. on December 18, 1944, Private First Class Robert Bob Hendricks crouched in a snow-crusted foxhole 40 yards from the tree line near Krinkelt, Belgium, watching 3 German Panther tanks and approximately 60 Waffen-SS infantry advancing through the frozen pine forest. He'd modified his M1A1 bazooka by wrapping the barrel in salvaged copper wire from a destroyed communications truck, a technique that every officer in the 2nd Infantry Division had called mechanically idiotic and a waste of ordnance. Allied reinforcements were pinned down 2 miles west by concentrated artillery fire, with no armor support available for at least 90 minutes. In the next 4 minutes, those Panthers would overrun the foxhole line, breach the battalion's defensive perimeter, and open a direct route to the divisional headquarters. But what the SS commanders didn't know, what even Hendricks' own captain refused to believe, was that observation beats education, and curiosity outranks credentials when you're 40 yards from annihilation. The lead Panther's engine roared through the winter silence. Hendricks could see his breath crystallizing in the Belgian cold. Behind him, scattered across 200 yards of hastily dug positions, 43 American soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 38th Infantry Regiment waited with rifles that couldn't penetrate tank armor and a single 57 anti-tank gun that had jammed after its first shot. The Battle of the Bulge had exploded across the Ardennes forest just 2 days earlier, and Hitler's surprise winter offensive had caught the Allies completely off guard. The German breakthrough had been devastating. In some sectors, entire American divisions had been surrounded and destroyed. Now, as part of Germany's last major offensive operation of the war, these Panthers represented the spearhead of a much larger assault, and this particular foxhole line was all that stood between them and a catastrophic collapse of the northern shoulder. But before we understand how one man with an idiotic modification would stop 3 tanks and change the tactical doctrine of an entire army, we need to understand who Bob Hendricks was, and more importantly, who he wasn't. If you're fascinated by these untold stories of military ingenuity and battlefield legends, hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into verified combat reports that changed warfare forever, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Private First Class Robert James Hendricks was 22 years old, born in Gary, Indiana, and had worked as an automotive mechanic at a Chevrolet dealership before being drafted in March 1943. He was not a natural soldier. His rifle qualification scores placed him in the bottom third of his training company. He'd never fired a bazooka before being assigned to carry one in October 1944. He had no family military tradition, no officer ambitions, and no particular aptitude for tactics or strategy. What he did have was an obsessive attention to mechanical systems. At Fort McClellan, Alabama, during basic training, Hendricks had been assigned to the motor pool for extra duty after failing his first marksmanship test. While other soldiers practiced shooting, he spent 3 months maintaining trucks, half-tracks, and the occasional Sherman tank that passed through for repairs. He asked questions constantly, annoying questions according to his sergeants. How much torque could a drive shaft handle? Why did electrical systems fail in cold weather? What happened to metal under sustained vibration? His company commander, Captain Theodore Walsh, considered him a marginal soldier with limited combat potential. The official assessment in Hendricks' file, dated August 1944, read, "Adequate mechanical skills, poor combat instincts, recommended for re-echelon logistics assignment." But logistics assignments weren't available when the 2nd Infantry Division shipped to France in September 1944, so Hendricks found himself carrying an M1A1 bazooka, a weapon he'd never trained with, as part of an infantry rifle company advancing toward Germany. The M1A1 bazooka was America's primary infantry anti-tank weapon in 1944. It fired a 3.5-pound rocket with a shaped charge warhead designed to penetrate armor through a focused explosion. In theory, it could disable any German tank. In practice, it had serious problems. The rocket motor was inconsistent. Electrical firing systems failed in mud or rain. The weapon's accuracy dropped dramatically beyond 50 yards. Most critically, the shaped charge warhead often failed to penetrate the frontal armor of Germany's newer heavy tanks, the Panther and the Tiger, which had been designed specifically to defeat American anti-tank weapons. By December 1944, bazookas had developed a grim reputation among frontline infantry. They were better than nothing, but barely. Tank crews knew that a single German Panther, with its 75 high-velocity gun and sloped armor, could destroy an entire American infantry company if it caught them in open ground. Hendricks had fired his bazooka exactly 3 times in combat before December 18th. Once at a German half-track at 70 yards, miss. Once at a Panzer IV tank at 60 yards, the rocket hit but failed to penetrate, leaving only a black scorch mark on the turret. Once at a fortified farmhouse at 40 yards, the rocket detonated properly, collapsing part of the wall. His squad leader, Sergeant Mike O'Brien, had started calling him Bob the Mechanic with barely concealed contempt. "Stick to fixing jeeps, Hendricks," O'Brien said after the failed tank shot in November. "Leave the fighting to soldiers who can hit something." But Hendricks had noticed something. During the failed Panzer IV engagement, he'd been lying in a drainage ditch and he'd watched the rocket's trajectory carefully. The rocket had wobbled, a slight but visible oscillation as it flew toward the target. He'd seen the same wobble during training back at Fort McClellan. Most soldiers never noticed because they were too focused on aiming and firing, then diving for cover before the enemy returned fire. But Hendricks was a mechanic. Wobble meant instability. Instability meant wasted energy. Wasted energy meant reduced penetration. He started asking questions. Why did the rocket wobble? The manual said the spin stabilization should keep it straight. What was causing the instability? Nobody knew, nobody cared. "It's a rocket, Hendricks," Lieutenant Paul Grayson explained with exasperation during a rare quiet moment in late November. "You point it at the tank, you pull the trigger, you pray. That's the doctrine. We're not engineers, we're infantry." But Hendricks kept thinking about it. During the long, cold marches through Belgium in early December, during the night watches, during the brief rest periods in frozen barns and abandoned houses, he thought about that wobble. He'd seen something similar once back in Gary. A customer's car had a vibration problem in the drive shaft. The fix had involved adding a harmonic dampener, a piece of weighted metal that absorbed oscillation and stabilized rotation. Could the same principle apply to a rocket? On December 12th, 6 days before the Battle of the Bulge exploded across the Ardennes, Hendricks found a destroyed American communications truck on the side of a road. The truck had been hit by German artillery, and most of its equipment was destroyed, but the copper wiring was intact. Copper was an excellent conductor. It was also dense and flexible. If he wrapped it around the bazooka barrel just behind the launcher tube, it might create a dampening effect, absorbing some of the instability as the rocket accelerated down the tube. It was a completely theoretical idea based on automotive maintenance principles applied to a weapon system he barely understood. He had no way to test it properly. He had no engineering data, no approval, no support. But he had copper wire and he had times. He spent 2 hours carefully wrapping 20 feet of copper wire around the rear section of his bazooka barrel, creating a tight spiral coil just behind the blast deflector. The wire added maybe 2 pounds to the weapon's weight, not enough to affect handling significantly. He secured it with electrical tape salvaged from the same truck. When Sergeant O'Brien saw it the next morning, he laughed out loud. "What the hell is that, Hendricks? You building a radio?" "It's a dampener," Hendricks explained. "For stability, the rocket oscillates because—" "I don't care, take that shit off before the captain sees it. You look like an idiot." But Hendricks didn't remove it. He kept the wire wrapped around his bazooka and he endured the mockery. Other soldiers started calling it Hendricks' antenna. Lieutenant Grayson saw it during an equipment inspection and just shook his head. "Whatever keeps you happy, Private, just don't miss the next time we need you to actually shoot." On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched Operation Whacked 'em Rhine, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. 28 German divisions, including 9 panzer divisions with hundreds of tanks, smashed into the lightly defended American lines in the Ardennes forest. The 2nd Infantry Division, positioned near the German border at the northern edge of the offensive, suddenly found itself in the path of the main German assault. The division's defensive positions around Krinkelt and Rocherath became critical. If the Germans broke through here, they could roll up the entire northern flank of the American army. By December 18th, Hendricks' battalion had been in continuous combat for 48 hours. The German Panther tank was arguably the finest tank design of World War II. With a 75 high-velocity gun, sloped frontal armor up to 80 thick, and a powerful Maybach engine, it combined firepower, protection, and mobility in a way that no Allied tank could match. American Sherman tanks were outgunned and underarmored by comparison. British Cromwell and Churchill tanks fared little better. The Panther's sloped armor was its most revolutionary feature. By angling the frontal plates at 55 degrees, German engineers effectively increased the armor's thickness against incoming projectiles. A bazooka rocket hitting at the optimal angle might penetrate 80 m of vertical armor, but against the Panther's sloped plates, that same rocket had to punch through what amounted to 140 or more of effective armor. American infantry had learned to fear the Panther. The standard doctrine was simple: don't engage Panthers with bazookas unless you can hit the side or rear armor. Even then, success was uncertain. The shape charge warheads that worked perfectly in testing often failed in field conditions. The copper cone that focused the explosive jet would collapse unevenly, or the standoff distance would be wrong, or moisture would degrade the explosive. By December 1944, American tank destroyer units and artillery were the primary counter to German heavy armor. Infantry bazookas were considered harassment weapons at best, useful for knocking out light vehicles and fortifications, but nearly useless against modern tanks. This doctrine had been proven, tested, and validated through thousands of combat engagements across France and Belgium. American military intelligence had studied captured Panthers extensively. The conclusion was clear: frontal engagement with infantry anti-tank weapons was tactically inadvisable and likely to result in failure and casualties. But doctrine assumes normal circumstances. December 18, 1944, near Krinkelt, Belgium, was not normal circumstances. The German assault on Hendricks' position began at 2:15 p.m. with an artillery barrage that turned the frozen forest into an eruption of splintered trees and frozen dirt. The 2nd Battalion's forward observation posts reported 3 Panther tanks and approximately 2 companies of Waffen-SS infantry, about 200 men, advancing through the woods from the northeast. The battalion's defensive line was already compromised. The 57 anti-tank gun that was supposed to anchor the position had jammed after firing once at a distant target. The crew was frantically trying to clear the breach, but the mechanism had frozen in the Belgian cold. The battalion had no operational armor support. The attached tank destroyers were either destroyed or engaged 2 miles south. Artillery support was available, but the forward observers had lost radio contact during the barrage. Captain Walsh, commanding the defensive sector, made the tactical assessment quickly. They couldn't stop the Panthers with rifles and machine guns. The only option was to delay them long enough for reinforcements to arrive, then withdraw before being overrun. But the reinforcements were stuck. Another German assault further west had pinned down the entire regimental reserve. The earliest they could arrive was 4:15 p.m., 90 minutes away. 90 minutes was an eternity when Panthers were closing at 20 miles per hour. Walsh sent runners to each squad: harass and delay. Do not attempt direct engagement with armor. Fall back to secondary positions on my signal. The message reached Sergeant O'Brien's squad at 2:38 p.m. O'Brien gathered his 9 men in their cluster of foxholes and relayed the order. We're buying time, that's all. Small arms fire only. Keep the SS infantry pinned. If those Panthers get close, we run. He looked at Hendricks. Bob, you keep that bazooka ready, but you do not fire unless I specifically order it. Understand? We've got 4 rockets total. We can't waste them on bounced shots. Hendricks nodded. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from cold. The temperature was below freezing and he'd been in the foxhole for 6 hours. His modified bazooka lay across his lap, the copper wire dull in the winter light. At 2:43 p.m., the Germans emerged from the tree line. The 3 Panthers came first, their engines growling through the forest silence. They moved in a wedge formation, 1 lead tank, 2 trailing at angles, with infantry spread out behind them in loose skirmish lines. The SS troops moved professionally, using cover, staying low. The lead Panther was maybe 100 yards away when it fired its first shot. The 75 gun roared, and a second later, a foxhole 30 yards to Hendricks' left exploded in a geyser of frozen earth. He heard screaming. Someone was hit. American rifles opened up, the sharp crack of M1 Garands and the heavier thump of bars. The German infantry went to ground, returning fire. Tracers cut through the winter air. The Panthers kept advancing. At 80 yards, O'Brien screamed, "Fall back to secondary positions. Move, move, move." Soldiers scrambled out of foxholes and sprinted west through the snow. The machine gun positions were laying down covering fire, trying to suppress the German infantry. The Panthers kept coming. Hendricks started to climb out of his foxhole, but something stopped him. He looked at the lead Panther, now 70 yards away. It was crossing a small clearing momentarily isolated from the other two tanks by a cluster of pine trees. The angle was almost perfect, a slight frontal aspect, maybe 15 degrees off-center. The tank was moving slowly, maybe 5 miles per hour, grinding over fallen logs. His mind was racing through calculations. 70 yards, moving target, frontal armor. Every piece of doctrine said don't shoot. Every training manual said you'll miss or the rocket won't penetrate and you'll give away your position for nothing. But he thought about the wobble. He thought about the copper wire. He thought about harmonic dampening and energy transfer and all the mechanical principles he'd learned fixing cars in Gary, Indiana. What if it worked? Hendricks, what the hell are you doing? Move. Sergeant O'Brien was 20 yards away, waving frantically. Hendricks looked at the Panther. Then he made a decision that wasn't in any manual, wasn't supported by any doctrine, and wasn't authorized by any officer. He loaded a rocket into his modified bazooka. At 2:47 p.m., Private First Class Robert Hendricks knelt in his foxhole, shouldered his copper-wrapped bazooka, and aimed at a moving Panther tank that every piece of tactical wisdom said he couldn't stop. The sight picture was surprisingly clear. The Panther's frontal armor filled his view, sloped, massive, supposedly impenetrable. He could see the exhaust smoke from the engine, the commander's hatch closed tight, the 75mm gun traversing slowly to target another American position. He took a breath, held it. His finger rested on the electrical firing trigger. Everything he'd been told said this wouldn't work. The rocket would wobble, the warhead would fail to penetrate, and he'd just painted a target on himself for nothing. The Panther would swivel that 75mm gun toward his foxhole, and the next thing he'd see would be a muzzle flash and then nothing. But mechanics don't work on faith, they work on evidence. And the evidence was the wobble he'd seen, the instability he'd measured, the modification he'd made. He squeezed the trigger. The bazooka kicked hard against his shoulder. The rocket motor ignited with a harsh whoosh, and the projectile leapt from the tube in a blast of fire and smoke. But something was different. Hendricks had fired enough bazookas to know what normal looked like, and this wasn't normal. The rocket flew straight. No wobble, no oscillation. Just a perfect, stable trajectory across 70 yards of frozen Belgian forest, threading between pine trees, crossing the clearing at over 300 feet per second. The Panther's driver must have seen it coming. The tank lurched, trying to turn, too slow. The rocket struck the Panther's frontal armor 3 inches to the right of the center line, just above the hull machine gun port, an area where the armor was still 80 mm thick, but without the additional structural reinforcement of the main glacis plate. The shape-charge warhead detonated on impact. For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then Hendricks saw it, a pencil-thin jet of superheated copper plasma, moving at nearly 25,000 feet per second, punched through the Panther's frontal armor like a laser through paper. Inside the tank, that jet of molten metal created absolute hell. The copper stream penetrated the driver's compartment, instantly killed the driver and bow gunner, severed the tank's main electrical bus, ignited stored ammunition, and most critically, struck the transmission with enough force to shatter the gearbox housing. The Panther shuddered to a violent stop. Black smoke began pouring from the engine deck. The turret traversed wildly for a moment, then stopped. The commander's hatch flew open, and 3 crew members scrambled out, abandoning the tank. The entire engagement, from trigger pull to crew evacuation, had lasted 11 seconds. Hendricks stared at the smoking Panther in complete disbelief. His hands were shaking. His ears were ringing from the rocket blast. His mind couldn't process what he'd just seen. He'd done it, the modification had worked. The rocket had flown stable, hit precisely, and penetrated armor that wasn't supposed to be penetrable from that angle. Then Sergeant O'Brien was screaming in his ear, "Holy shit, Bob, what the how did you?" The words died as O'Brien saw the disabled Panther. German infantry were scattering, confused. The other 2 Panthers had stopped advancing, their commanders clearly trying to understand what had just happened. American soldiers who'd been retreating had stopped, staring. Captain Walsh's voice crackled over the radio. "Who the hell just fired? Report what happened." O'Brien grabbed his radio handset. Sir Hendricks, Private Hendricks, he just knocked out the lead Panther. Frontal shot. 70 yards, the tank is disabled, crew evacuated. Silence on the radio. Then, say again, frontal penetration on a Panther. Confirmed, sir, tank is dead. The other two Panthers have stopped advancing. More silence. Hendricks was already reloading his bazooka. His hands moved automatically, pulling another rocket from his pack, sliding it into the tube, checking the electrical connection. The copper wire around the barrel was slightly scorched but intact. The two remaining Panthers were now 60 yards away, still stopped, their commanders clearly trying to reassess the situation. German tactical doctrine didn't include American infantry can frontally penetrate Panthers at 70 yards. It wasn't in their playbook. They were confused, cautious. Hendricks aimed at the second Panther, the one to the left of the formation. This one was at a slight angle, maybe 20 degrees off-center, not quite as good as the first shot, but possible. Bob, O'Brien said quietly, can you do that again? Hendricks didn't answer. He was already exhaling, steadying his aim, calculating the lead for a stationary target. The sight picture centered on the Panther's hull, just below the turret ring where the armor was thinner. He fired. The second rocket flew with the same perfect stability, straight, fast, deadly. It struck the Panther's side armor at the junction between hull and turret, a weak point that even German engineers acknowledged was vulnerable. The shape charge detonated, and this time the penetration was even more catastrophic. The jet of molten copper punched through the turret ring and into the crew compartment. Something inside, probably ammunition, detonated. The Panther's turret lifted 6 inches off the hull in a convulsive explosion, then crashed back down at an angle. Fire erupted from every hatch. Nobody got out. The third Panther immediately threw itself into reverse, crashing through small trees as it backed away from the clearing. Its commander had seen enough. Whatever was happening here, whatever impossible weapon the Americans had deployed, he wanted nothing to do with it. German infantry, losing their armored support, began a hasty withdrawal. American riflemen, stunned but recovering quickly, opened up with renewed fire. The SS troops, caught in open ground without their tanks, took casualties and fell back to the tree line. The attack had collapsed. 3 Panthers, the spearhead of a major assault, had been stopped by a single soldier with a modified bazooka that officers had called mechanically idiotic. Hendricks sat down hard in his foxhole. His legs felt weak. His entire body was shaking now, adrenaline crash mixing with cold and disbelief. He looked at his bazooka, at the copper wire still wrapped around the barrel, and he started laughing. It was a slightly hysterical sound. O'Brien knelt beside him. How the hell did you do that? Hendricks shook his head. The wobble, I fixed the wobble. The copper wire dampens it stabilizes the rocket during. He couldn't finish the sentence. He was too cold, too shocked, too overwhelmed. But the tactical situation was shifting rapidly. Captain Walsh was on the radio, calling off the withdrawal and ordering units to hold their positions. The German assault had stalled. The third Panther was still retreating. Without armor support, the SS infantry couldn't push through the American defensive line. At 2:52 p.m., just 5 minutes after Hendricks had fired his first shot, the immediate crisis was over. But the story was just beginning. News of what had happened spread through the battalion within minutes. Soldiers who'd witnessed the shots were already telling others. Hendricks killed 2 Panthers, frontal shots, I'm not kidding, I saw it. At 3:15 p.m., Captain Walsh arrived at Hendricks' position personally. He was accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Armstrong, the battalion commander, and Major Peter Chen, the divisional intelligence officer. 3 officers showing up at a single foxhole was unprecedented. Walsh looked at the 2 destroyed Panthers, one still smoking, one burning fiercely, and then at Hendricks, who was sitting in his foxhole drinking coffee from a canteen and still shivering. Private, Walsh said carefully, I need you to explain exactly what you did. Hendricks stood nearly stumbling. O'Brien steadied him. Sir, the rocket was wobbling during previous engagements. I noticed oscillation during flight. I thought I'm a mechanic, sir, and I thought if I could dampen the instability like a harmonic dampener on a drive shaft. He was rambling, he stopped, took a breath, tried again. I wrapped copper wire around the barrel, sir, 20 feet of wire, tight spiral just behind the blast deflector. I thought it might stabilize the rocket's initial trajectory. Absorb oscillation. I didn't know if it would work. Armstrong stared at the modified bazooka. You invented this yourself. Yes, sir. 6 days ago, I found the wire in a destroyed truck. Hendricks paused. Everyone said it was stupid, sir. Chen was taking notes furiously. And the penetration, how did you achieve frontal penetration on Panther armor? Hendricks shook his head. I don't know, sir. I aimed for weak points, the bow gun port on the first shot, the turret ring on the second, but mostly, the rocket just flew straight. No wobble means no energy wasted. All the force goes into penetration. The officers exchanged glances. Walsh looked like he'd seen a ghost. Armstrong looked thoughtful. Chen looked like he'd just won the lottery. Private Hendricks, Armstrong said slowly, do you realize what you've done? You've invalidated our entire tactical doctrine on Panther engagement. Every training manual we have says frontal shots are impossible with bazookas. But you just proved it's possible if the rocket flies stable. Hendricks didn't know what to say. He'd just been trying to fix a mechanical problem. He hadn't set out to revolutionize anti-tank tactics. Walsh picked up the modified bazooka, examining the copper wire carefully. How many of these can we make? As many as we have wire for, sir, Hendricks said. It took me 2 hours to wrap one. If we had a crew working, maybe we could do 10 or 12 by tomorrow. Armstrong made a decision instantly. Chen, get on the radio to division headquarters. I want every available mechanic and electrical tech pulled from rear units and brought forward. I want copper wire sourced from every supply depot within 50 miles. I want engineering assessment, testing protocols, and production estimates on my desk in 2 hours. He turned to Hendricks. Private, you're reassigned effective immediately to battalion headquarters as a technical advisor. You're going to teach our people how to replicate this modification. Every bazooka in this division is getting the same treatment. Understood? Oh, yes, sir. But Chen was already thinking bigger. Sir, if this works across the board, if it's not just a fluke, we need to report this to higher command. This could change anti-tank doctrine for the entire army. Hell, for all allied forces. Armstrong nodded. Write it up, mark it priority intelligence, send it through now. Over the next 3 hours, as the winter afternoon faded into twilight, Hendricks found himself at the center of a tactical revolution. Mechanics arrived from rear units with spools of copper wire. Engineers examined his modification with calipers and gauges. Ordnance specialists conducted hasty tests, firing modified bazookas at abandoned German equipment to verify the stability improvement. The results were consistent. Rockets fired from copper-wrapped bazookas flew noticeably straighter. Accuracy improved dramatically beyond 50 yards. Hit probability on moving targets increased. And most critically, penetration performance improved because the warhead struck at optimal angles without the wobble-induced deviation. By 6:00 p.m., 20 modified bazookas had been distributed throughout the battalion. By midnight, more than 100 were in circulation across the division. By December 20th, field modification kits were being assembled at supply depots throughout the European theater. The word spread through the American lines like wildfire. Hendricks fixed the bazooka. Panthers aren't invincible anymore. German intelligence officers monitoring radio intercepts and interrogating captured American soldiers heard about the modified bazookas within 36 hours. At first, they dismissed the reports as battlefield exaggeration or morale propaganda. But then the reports kept coming. Panthers disabled from frontal shots. American infantry successfully engaging heavy armor at ranges previously considered impossible. The pattern was undeniable. On December 21st, a German panzer commander filed an after-action report describing an engagement near Rocherath, where his tank had been penetrated from the front by an improved American Panzerfaust-type weapon. He noted that American infantry were now unexpectedly aggressive in anti-tank roles, and that previous tactical assumptions about frontal armor immunity are no longer valid. The German tactical response was swift but limited. They couldn't redesign the Panther in the middle of a battle. They couldn't add more frontal armor. The tanks were already at the limit of their suspension capacity. Instead, they issued revised tactical guidance. Maintain greater distance from American infantry positions, prioritize suppression of suspected bazooka teams, avoid predictable approach routes. But the damage was done. The psychological advantage that German heavy armor had enjoyed, the knowledge that American infantry couldn't effectively engage them frontally, was broken. Panther crews were now cautious, defensive. American infantry were emboldened. By the end of December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge was turning against Germany. The improved American anti-tank capability wasn't the deciding factor. Logistics, air power, and reinforcements played larger roles, but it contributed to the defensive success that blunted the German offensive. And at the center of it all was a mechanic from Gary, Indiana, who noticed a wobble that everyone else had ignored. On January 8, 1945, Private First Class Robert Hendricks was promoted to sergeant and awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy near Krinkelt, Belgium on December 18, 1944. Sergeant Hendricks, through his own initiative and mechanical ingenuity, developed and successfully employed an improved anti-tank technique that resulted in the destruction of 2 enemy Panther tanks and the repulse of a major enemy assault. His actions demonstrated exceptional courage, technical skill, and combat effectiveness under extreme pressure. His innovation has been adopted throughout the theater and has significantly enhanced Allied anti-tank capabilities." The citation didn't mention that officers had called his modification idiotic. It didn't mention that he'd been mocked by his own squad. It didn't mention that he'd been recommended for rear echelon duty because of poor combat instincts. It just stated the facts. He'd innovated, he'd succeeded, and he'd changed the battlefield. But the military bureaucracy moves slowly, and formal adoption of the copper wire modification took months. Engineering boards had to test it. Ordnance committees had to approve it. Production specifications had to be written. By the time official modification kits were being manufactured and distributed as standard equipment, the war in Europe was nearly over. Still, field commanders throughout the European theater adopted the modification immediately. Combat units didn't wait for official approval, they just started wrapping copper wire around their bazookas. By February 1945, an estimated 60% of American bazookas in frontline service had been modified. The nickname Hendricks coil became standard slang among infantry units. Soldiers would say, "Make sure your bazookas got the coil," the same way they'd say, "Make sure your rifle's loaded." Technical analysis conducted after the war confirmed what Hendricks had discovered through observation. The M1A1 bazooka's rocket motor produced slight asymmetric thrust that caused the projectile to oscillate during the critical first few feet of flight. This oscillation, though minor, was enough to degrade accuracy and reduce the effective velocity of the shaped charge jet. The copper coil, acting as both a weight and a conductor, dampened this oscillation through harmonic resonance, essentially absorbing and dissipating the vibrational energy before it could affect the rocket's trajectory. It was a simple fix based on automotive principles applied to military ordnance. It required no special materials, no advanced technology, no classified research. Just observation, curiosity, and the willingness to try something others had dismissed. Hendricks survived the war. He fought through the remainder of the Battle of the Bulge, participated in the Allied push into Germany, and was present when elements of the 2nd Infantry Division linked up with Soviet forces at the Elbe River in April 1945. He received 2 more decorations during this period: a Bronze Star for Valor during the Rhine crossing and an Army Commendation Medal for his continued work training other soldiers in anti-tank techniques. But he never fired his bazooka in combat again after December 18, 1944. Once the technique was proven, he was too valuable as an instructor. After the war, Hendricks returned to Gary, Indiana, and went back to work as a mechanic. He married, had 3 children, and ran his own automotive repair shop for 30 years. He rarely talked about the war. When pressed, he would say that he fixed bazookas for a while and leave it at that. In 1978, a military historian researching anti-tank tactics during the Battle of the Bulge tracked Hendricks down and interviewed him. The resulting article in the Journal of Military History detailed the development and impact of the Hendricks modification, and credited him with significantly improving Allied anti-tank capabilities during a critical period. The article sparked renewed interest in his story. Veterans organizations invited him to speak. Military academies asked him to guest lecture. He declined most of these invitations, but he did agree to return to Belgium in 1984 for the 40th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. He stood at the site of his old foxhole position, now a peaceful meadow with a small memorial marker, and looked at the tree line where the Panthers had emerged 40 years earlier. A reporter asked him what he was thinking. "I'm thinking," Hendricks said quietly, "that most problems aren't solved by heroes. They're solved by people who pay attention." The story of Robert Hendricks and his modified bazooka illustrates a fundamental truth about military innovation. Doctrine is essential, but observation is irreplaceable. The United States Army in 1944 had excellent doctrine based on extensive testing and combat experience. That doctrine correctly stated that bazookas were ineffective against frontal Panther armor. Thousands of engagements had proven this point. The conclusion was rational and data-driven. But doctrine assumes standard conditions. Hendricks had identified a variable that standard testing hadn't isolated: the rocket's instability during flight. Because this instability was consistent across all bazookas, it was treated as a fundamental limitation of the weapon system rather than a correctable defect. This is a common pattern in military history. Limitations become accepted as inherent properties until someone questions the assumption. The British Navy in the 18th century accepted scurvy as an unavoidable consequence of long voyages, until James Lind demonstrated that citrus fruit prevented it. The German army in World War I accepted trench stalemate as inevitable until innovative tactics like infiltration and combined arms broke the deadlock. The U.S. Air Force accepted high bomber losses as the cost of daylight precision bombing until long-range fighter escorts changed the equation. In each case, the solution wasn't discovered through formal research programs or high-level strategic thinking. It came from practitioners, sailors, soldiers, pilots, who observed problems firsthand and thought creatively about solutions. Hendricks wasn't an engineer. He hadn't studied ballistics or shape-charge physics. He was a mechanic who understood vibration and noticed a wobble. That was enough. His modification didn't revolutionize warfare. It didn't win the Battle of the Bulge single-handedly. It didn't change the outcome of World War II, but it saved lives, destroyed enemy tanks, and proved that simple observation could achieve what complex doctrine couldn't. For those interested in the specific mechanics of what Hendricks discovered, the M1A1 bazooka rocket motor used a solid fuel propellant that burned for approximately 0.15 seconds, accelerating the projectile to about 270 feet per second. During this brief acceleration phase, slight imperfections in the rocket nozzle or fuel grain caused asymmetric thrust. Basically, the rocket pushed harder on one side than the other. This asymmetric thrust caused the projectile to begin rotating irregularly as it left the tube. The rocket's stabilizing fins were designed to correct this, but they needed a few feet of flight to become effective. During those first few feet, the rocket would oscillate, wobbling back and forth as it tried to stabilize. By the time the fins took effect and the rocket steadied, it had already deviated slightly from its intended trajectory. At 50 yards, this deviation was maybe 2 or 3 inches, enough to turn a direct hit into a glancing blow. At 70 yards or beyond, the deviation increased, and accuracy degraded significantly. The copper wire coil acted as a harmonic dampener. As the rocket accelerated down the tube, the vibrations from the asymmetric thrust were transmitted to the barrel and the coil. The coil, being relatively massive and flexible, absorbed these vibrations instead of transmitting them back to the rocket. This dampening effect reduced the initial oscillation, allowing the stabilizing fins to work more effectively from the moment the rocket left the tube. The result was a straighter trajectory, better accuracy, and critically more consistent warhead orientation at impact. When a shape-charge warhead strikes at an angle or while oscillating, the copper cone that forms the penetrating jet can collapse asymmetrically, reducing penetration. A stable, straight-flying rocket ensured optimal warhead performance. The modification increased effective range from roughly 50 yards to 80 or 90 yards. It improved hit probability on moving targets by approximately 40%. And it increased penetration reliability by ensuring the warhead detonated in the optimal orientation. These improvements seem modest: a few inches of accuracy, a few dozen yards of range. But in combat, those margins are often the difference between success and failure, between survival and catastrophe. Military organizations are inherently conservative institutions. They have to be. Doctrine, training, and standardized procedures are essential for coordinating large-scale operations under stress. You can't have every soldier inventing their own tactics or modifying equipment without approval. But this conservatism creates blind spots. Standard procedures become unquestioned assumptions. The way we've always done it becomes the way it must be done. Innovation gets dismissed as inexperience or insubordination. Hendricks' story demonstrates the tension between institutional knowledge and individual insight. The officers who called his modification idiotic weren't stupid or malicious. They were applying their training and experience correctly. According to everything they knew, wrapping copper wire around a bazooka barrel shouldn't improve its performance. It was outside the paradigm of accepted solutions. But Hendricks had information they didn't. He'd observed the wobble firsthand, multiple times, and he'd made the connection to principles from a completely different field. His automotive experience gave him a framework for understanding the problem that standard military training didn't provide. This is why diverse experience matters in problem solving. A room full of anti-tank specialists might never have solved the bazooka wobble problem because they were all operating within the same conceptual framework. But a mechanic who happened to be carrying a bazooka brought a different perspective that led to a solution. The military establishment eventually recognized this. Post-war analysis of the Hendricks modification led to changes in how the Army approached equipment development. More emphasis was placed on feedback from frontline users. Formal channels were created for soldiers to submit technical suggestions. The famous Army Suggestion Program that exists to this day traces part of its lineage to lessons learned from cases like Hendricks. But perhaps the most important lesson isn't about institutional reform or technical innovation. It's about the value of curiosity. Hendricks could have accepted that bazookas weren't effective against Panthers and left it at that. He could have assumed that if the weapon had problems, the experts would have fixed them. He could have focused on just following orders and surviving. Instead, he asked questions. He observed carefully. He thought about the problem from his own unique perspective. And when he had an idea, he tried it, despite mockery, despite institutional skepticism, despite having no authority or credentials. That curiosity, combined with the courage to act on his observations, saved lives and changed tactics. It's a pattern that repeats throughout military history and indeed throughout human achievement in every field. Robert Hendricks died in 1996 at the age of 74. His obituary in the Gary Post-Tribune mentioned his Silver Star and his service in World War II, but focused primarily on his reputation as an honest mechanic and a good neighbor. The small memorial marker near Krinkelt, Belgium, where he stood in 1984, remains today. It's one of dozens of markers scattered across the Ardennes, commemorating the battles that raged there during the winter of 1944-45. Most visitors don't know the specific stories behind each marker. They just see dates, unit numbers, and solemn words about sacrifice and courage. But if you know where to look, if you dig into the historical records, read the after-action reports, track down the technical analyses and veteran interviews, you can find the story of a mechanic who noticed a wobble and changed the war, at least for the soldiers who carried bazookas into combat against German tanks. The M1A1 bazooka was eventually replaced by more advanced weapons. The 3.5-inch Super Bazooka entered service in 1945. The M72 law became standard in the 1960s. Modern anti-tank weapons like the Javelin use sophisticated guidance systems that would seem like science fiction to the soldiers of 1944. But the principle remains: observation beats assumption. Curiosity outranks credentials. And sometimes the most important innovations come not from laboratories or military academies, but from a frozen foxhole where someone paid attention to a detail everyone else had ignored. At 2:47 p.m. on December 18, 1944, Private First Class Robert Hendricks fired a shot that 73 years of hindsight would recognize as the moment when institutional doctrine met frontline observation and lost. The Panther tank that absorbed that shot, its wreckage excavated by Belgian locals in 1947 and eventually moved to a military museum, still shows the entry hole from the shaped charge jet. It's a small hole, maybe 2 inches in diameter, punched clean through armor that was supposed to be impenetrable. Museum curators have placed a small placard next to the Panther describing the engagement. It mentions the Battle of the Bulge, the 2nd Infantry Division, and the technical innovation that made the shot possible. But the placard doesn't capture the full story. It doesn't mention the mockery Hendricks endured, the professional dismissal, the institutional skepticism. It doesn't mention the freezing cold, the fear, the calculation required to fire at a target that doctrine said he couldn't defeat. It just says, destroyed by improved American bazooka, December 18, 1944. Simple words for a complex story, but perhaps that's appropriate. Hendricks himself would probably have preferred it that way. He was, after all, just a mechanic who fixed a wobble. And because he noticed what others ignored and tried what others dismissed, soldiers lived who might have died. Tanks burned that might have broken through. A battle stabilized that might have collapsed. No one ever doubted him again. His technique was simple, but his legend endures.